Hi, everyone. Welcome back. So, we are looking at conflict this week, and I have been waiting to share these stories with you for 6 weeks. So, I am super excited. We have Roman Fever by Edith Wharton. We have Use of Force by William Carlos Williams. And you have a really great instructional text this week from an author, Ethan Bryant, and his book Dreamfield, where I show you the before and the after and talk about conflict and how it affects plot and characterization and some really important elements that were kind of missing from the first draft. So I think honestly, other than possibly the Sutherland book that I wrote 8 different times, I think that the changes that Ethan make probably are the largest changes we've seen so far and probably had the biggest impact on the text and on the story. I don't know if he had been unwilling to make those changes. I don't know if we would have been able to publish his book. So it's very interesting the way he took suggestions, what he did with them, how he reworked his manuscript. And it's a great lesson of being an author who is really willing to look at their work and kind of fix it and redo it and put in the time and effort, which he definitely did, and he always does with every book that he writes. Quite frankly, he's amazing. So let's talk about our short stories first, though. So Roman Fever is one of my favorite short stories of all time, and it is featuring two American women, Mrs. Ansley and Mrs. Slade. And I almost use this one for dialogue because they are saying things to each other. They're essentially, for lack of a better term, they're frenemies, right? They're friends. They have these daughters. Each of them has a daughter who is about the age that they were when they met. So they have these two teenage daughters. And they're saying things to each other in like really veiled ways, and the conflict between them is not really completely apparent at first. So what's great about this story is that as the plot is building to this climax, the conflict between these two women is at first veiled and kind of hidden. You might even, if I wasn't telling you this, you might think that they were great friends. They're not. But you might think that they were great friends. And then, very slowly, the conflict builds, and we see them get more and more kind of openly hostile and angry with each other. And it builds up, and then there's this release of tension in which some things are revealed about why they feel this way and what actually went down between them all those years ago. So here are some examples of this. Some of the conflict is shown through the inner thoughts. Some of it's shown through the dialogue, and a little bit of it is shown through the narration, which is kind of snarky in some places. So here's a little excerpt. "It always will be to me," assented her friend, Mrs. Ansley, with a so slightly stress on the word me that Mrs. Slade, though she noticed it, wondered if it were merely accidental, like those random underlinings of old-fashioned letter writers. "Grace Ansley is always so old-fashioned," she thought, and added aloud with a retrospective smile, "It's a view we've both become familiar with for a good many years. When we first met here, we were younger than our girls now. You remember." "Oh, yes, I remember," murmured Mrs. Ansley with an undefinable stress. "There's that head waiter wondering," she interpolated. She was evidently far less sure than her companion of herself and her rights in the world. "I'll cure him of wondering," said Mrs. Slade. So they're having this meal together, but the little stress on different words, right? Like, and then the other person is like, "Did she do that on accident or was that on purpose?" And you discover the little bit of rancor, but it's to me it's kind of hilarious because they're these upper crust women from a very high society. They're both very wealthy, and they're eating on Park Avenue. And then you find out what happened during this Roman spring that caused this conflict to begin with. And hint, it has to do with a guy, not so surprisingly. And then we have a breaking of the tension, and is there a resolution? I don't think so, but one of the two women says something, and that's how it ends. So somebody gets the upper hand at the end of the story. Somebody gets the upper hand. Now, I will tell you, just as a note, the way that this came out in PDF, there's a couple weird when I transferred it to a PDF for you guys, there's a couple weird symbols here and there by the quotation marks every once in a while. So that's just something to note. Those shouldn't be there, and you'll be able to kind of spot those. But yeah, it's a really great story where, it's a person versus person, woman versus woman conflict. And if it were a story of two men battling over a woman, there would probably be some punches thrown. But because it's two women kind of arguing over a man, it's just little verbal barbs here and there at each other to give a little hurt here and a little hurt there. So it's a really subtle conflict, but I think a really interesting one, and that's why I picked it for you. The other story, Use of Force, is not a subtle conflict at all, by William Carlos Williams. So William Carlos Williams is an author who previously to becoming a writer was a physician. And I don't know how true this story is, but it seems like it might be pretty true. It is the story of a doctor who is coming to help this family named with the last name Olson. They have a daughter who is very sick, and she has diphtheria. And essentially, there is a conflict between the doctor and his patient. The little girl does not really appreciate the doctor being there and does not want to be treated for her illness. And her parents are kind of coddling her, and she's kind of being a little brat. And who comes out on top? Who's to say? I almost don't want to give away anything more than that out of the story, but things to look for. How the parents are talking about the doctor, the way that he doesn't want them to talk about him, to set him up in the mind of this little girl in a certain way. So he wants her to look at him in a certain way, and they're kind of getting in the way of that. And then this girl, what she does, how she fights him, how they're kind of interfering. They're kind of being like helicopter parents, we would call it today. They're interfering, and it's quite a humorous conflict. And so, every story that we've looked at so far has had a conflict in some way, shape, or form. But I think here, what's interesting, and the reason that I paired this with Roman Fever, even though you only have to read one of them, is that this conflict is quite physical. So the first conflict in Roman Fever is person versus person, but it's really verbal, right? It's almost all dialogue, because it's just these two women sitting and having lunch. So it's quite a verbal disagreement. And the conflict comes out through what they say. But here, the use of force, it's called the use of force for a reason. So here is a little bit of an excerpt. Go get me a smooth-handled spoon of some sort. We're going to be through with this. The child's mouth was already bleeding. Her tongue was cut, and she was screaming in wild, hysterical shrieks. Perhaps I should have desisted and come back in an hour or more. No doubt it would have been better. So her mouth is bloody because she's been trying to bite him, essentially, and he puts a wooden thing in her mouth and she just bites right through it and it splinters, and then he needs to go get another one. And it's a great look at medicine, when doctors came to your house and you didn't go to them. So so that's what to look for in the two stories. Look for the humorous tone that comes through the conflict. Look for the verbal conflict in the one and the very subtle characterization in the other one. The characterization is much more clear. The conflict is much more clear from the get-go, and it's a lot more physical than our first stories. So those are things to look for. So let's talk about Dreamfield by Ethan Bryant. This is our creative writing sample. What I've done is given you a few excerpts from what was originally the end of the novel that ended up not being the end, but ended up coming about maybe 2/3 of the way through, maybe 3/4 of the way through. So he added quite a bit to this book. And I gave you a little taste in the revision section. But Dreamfield is about a man who, it's a contemporary adult novel. It's about a man who is living in 2015 with his wife and his 2 kids, and he really only has one regret in life, and that's that he played baseball his entire life except his senior year of high school. Through a series of events, he travels back in time, somehow transported back in time to 1992, and he has this stellar final season of playing baseball. And then once it's over, he wants to come back to the present, which is 2015. So in the original version, he comes back to the present. He's happy to be there. He's happy to see his wife and his kids. And then he hugs his wife, kisses his kids, and goes to work. And it did not work. The reason it didn't work is because a lot of the conflict driving this book was internal. It was Ethan struggling with himself, a little bit struggling against the forces of nature to get back to 2015. But it was really Ethan struggling with himself to balance this new life of playing baseball and being in high school again, and that kind of inner emotional journey. And so when the internal conflict should have come to a climax and we should have had a turning point, essentially we built up on that Freytag pyramid, and then it was just resolved. So there's no actual turning point. There was no actual climax, and the conflict felt flat because there was no tension anymore. So you're following this guy through what essentially was about 300 pages of this book, and then there's just nothing. And you're kind of like, well, why did he go through all of that if he's just going to go right back home and just be a good dad again, right? There was no point to it. There's no point to that inner conflict of struggling with being a kid again and having to do chores and all of that kind of thing. So what happens in the second version is that when he goes back, things have changed. And he slowly finds out through talking to his friends that basically that final year of baseball changed a little bit of his personality. He had an injury. He has got an addiction from that injury. He tried to keep chasing glory, wanted to be pro, all of that kind of thing. And so his new reality is much different. And now he has a compelling reason to go back a second time, briefly, make those changes, and then have the life that he had before just a little bit richer. So in a way, that inner conflict comes to a head, comes to a turning point, is driven even more in the story because now he has this life that he didn't remember. He has an addiction that he doesn't even remember having, but physically it's kind of there. He has a he had these hopes and these dreams that weren't followed up on, that he does still remember doing in his original life, these friends that are not really friends anymore. And so, yeah, the conflict completely comes to a boiling point because he's really struggling with himself to understand how he ended up making these changes from high school through college through the beginning parts of his career. So I think it's a really great example of, again, some of these things coming together, the conflict, the plot, and again, the characterization, right? We have his inner dilemma. How can he get back to his normal life? How can he now, it's not just with himself, but it's about time and space as well, right? As it should be in a time travel story. And the new resolution, it's much more authentic. The resolution that came in the book was much more authentic in the published version. That he had this journey for a reason, that he learned things from it, and the conflict that he had within himself about, he kind of realizes, yeah, I did want that other life. I was happy, but I kind of, in the back of my mind, wanted to play baseball because I wanted to play baseball. I wanted to be a ball player. I wanted to be a professional athlete. And so I think the internal conflict, the external conflict, the plot arc, the characterization, all of those are really enriched because of the changes to this text. So that is what I hope you learn from the instructional text this week, how to edit for that and how to have really an authentic resolution to whatever conflict you're presenting. Whether it's internal, whether like the stories, it's person versus person, whether you have somebody battling or rebelling against society, whether technology comes up and rises up against people, whether it's someone in a storm fighting against nature, that the resolution of that conflict feels real and that it's compelling and that it's something that the readers want to see. So that's what I hope you learn, and I can't wait to see your thoughts in the discussion forum. Thanks, everybody.